Welcome everyone to the April 15th, 2025 meeting of the Housing and Community Development Committee. And we could have a roll call, I think, for quorum.
Chair Ravel.
Here.
Commissioner Harikares.
Here.
Trina Antamira.
Here.
Fran Sweeney.
Here.
Chloe Thurston.
Here.
Joanne Zalimi.
Here. Zalomi.
Zalomi.
Okay, thank you. So we have a quorum and we're ready to start our business. I don't believe we have anybody signed up for public comment. All right, we'll get right to our agenda. So the first item is approval of the minutes of our March 18th meeting. Could I have a motion?
I will move approval of the Tuesday, March 18th minutes.
Okay, and a second?
Second.
Any questions, comments, discussion? Then all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. All right, we have our minutes.
I'm abstaining.
What? You're whispering too quietly. I can't help it. Oh,
Chair, I was abstaining just because I wasn't here.
beg your pardon?
I was abstaining from the minutes, that's all.
Oh, so are the minutes incorrect?
No, I meant I didn't
Oh,
say aye.
yes, got it. I got it. Thank you. Okay, that's clear now. Okay, onward. So we have two items for discussion this evening to give direction to staff or some further work on these two issues. So the first one is a ban on the use of price-fixing software in Evanston's rental housing market. Councilmember Harikares, you want to make a motion?
I will move the item for discussion.
Okay, and I believe we have a staff presentation.
Yes, good evening, Chair and members of the Housing Committee.
I think the microphone needs to be a little.
The light is on. Test. Oh, there we go. Okay. Again, Liz Williams, Planning Manager with the City of Evanston. So this evening, we wanted to bring before the committee two items. The first for discussion only is a referral related to price fixing software. And the referral specifically looks at banning the use of this technology as it relates to our rental housing market here in Evanston. This was referred by Councilmember Harikares. So before I get into it, was there anything you wanted to add on the referral?
No.
Okay, thank you. All right, so what is price fixing software? So we included this in your memo, but essentially it refers to technological tools, platforms, or systems that help facilitate the manipulation or coordination of rental prices among housing providers, property managers, or real estate firms. There are several different kind of components to this technology. It helps support tracking of competitor prices and suggest adjustments that align industry pricing. So this can lead to increases in rents that are being charged in the community. It also provides a real-time kind of rent changes. So as buildings rent at perhaps a higher price, it then correlates and kind of takes a look across the market and provides that data to other users in the system. It also does take a look at kind of differences in terms of tenant preferences in terms of pricing, regional differences in pricing, and also kind of is used to analyze customer behavior. So it's really to understand the market, and in a lot of ways it coordinates and can manipulate our rental prices specifically. So there are several different examples of this software. The most kind of prominent right now is RealPage and Yardi. And I want to caveat this discussion this evening that these software have many different types of extensions and kind of arms to them in terms of the services that they provide to their customers. So not all of those arms or different tools that are within these platforms necessarily lead to the coordination of price fixing, but some of them do. So it's something we need to look a little bit deeper into as a city to understand kind of who is using what technology here in Evanston so that we can best shape the regulations around that. In terms of kind of the legal landscape on this topic, there's one case currently out there. The Department of Justice is suing RealPage for facilitating illegal coordination to establish rental prices. Basically, the case claims that it's a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, and there's a section of that act that speaks to any agreement or conspiracy to restrain trade, including price fixing, is a per se violation of this federal law. So that case, to my knowledge, is still pending. There is a preliminary kind of settlement that's been outlined, which basically would mean that the parties subject to this suit would need to cease use of this technology, is kind of the settlement that they're working towards. In terms of how other municipalities have addressed this use of technology, there's really only two examples out there. This is a relatively new policy initiative. So San Francisco was the first to enact legislation. This was in September of 2024. And then they also Philadelphia is the other municipality. They recently, at the end of last year, passed an ordinance that did prohibit any use of this software. So tonight, we really just wanted to open it up for discussion amongst the committee. There is one technicality because this is a referral, and the council will be transitioning at the end of the month. This topic or referral will need to be re-referred by members of the 82nd City Council. So in order for this to come back to HCDC, we will need that referral to be reestablished. I don't see why that wouldn't be the case, but I can't say that with full confidence. But it would be our goal to get direction this evening, and then we would work as staff to bring back any information that this commission would find valuable in your deliberations, and some proposed language for an ordinance that the city could pursue. Based on that, we would be seeking a recommendation, and ultimately that recommendation would go to the city council. So I think tonight it would be really of value from staff's perspective to understand what additional information you would want to see on this topic, and how we can best aid in your consideration.
Great, thank you. So committee, all right, is that Chloe or is that, okay.
Thanks. This is really interesting. Yeah.
It is.
Do that. I guess one question, I liked the next steps, especially just trying to figure out what local housing providers are even doing, like what, continue to research into the software use. I guess a question I had was like, how should we think about the fact that Evanston is a smaller city next to a very large city, and some housing providers operate across borders? And should we be thinking about that too in terms of how we think about enforcement and enforceability of something like this?
Yeah, I think from staff's perspective, enforcement is going to be the biggest kind of thing that we'll have to grapple with this policy. A lot of it would be driven, I think, by complaints from residents. My understanding in doing the preliminary research into who is using what technology in Evanston, there are housing providers that do use some of these softwares. However, they're not necessarily necessarily using the extension of that software that leads to the coordination and concerns that are happening in other. It's YieldStar specifically from, I believe, Yardi is one of the items that is of a lot of concern in terms of what is leading to the coordination amongst housing providers.
That's interesting.
But we haven't to date found that any of the housing providers in Evanston are specifically using that component of the software package.
I see. I guess the question I'm wondering, and it's kind of related, I guess those haven't been around long enough to even be able to grapple with, would be, what if you're using, what if you're pricing in a market that allows that, that's right next door to ours, is kind of then informs decisions made here, even if you're not actually using the software?
Absolutely. And I think that's the traditional method that a lot of housing providers will use is they'll tap into, software like Zillow to see what regional or kind of neighboring jurisdictions are getting in terms of rent. I think the concern comes in is when you have algorithms that are taking in real-time data and then spitting out kind of recommendations based on the coordination amongst the different users of that platform. And that's really what I think this type of policy is trying to prevent.
The trust part of it.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Councilmember Harakaris?
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. This is there were some software packages on there that I was not aware of, and this is something that I think, like 6 months or so, I attended like a seminar or a talk talking about housing, and they mentioned RealPage specifically as a driving factor for rising, a contributing factor to rising rents. And, that one kind of stands out because it, from what I've heard, it is expensive, and you have to have like most of the housing, like this is not something that, a small mom and pop, someone renting their 2 flat is going to be, tapped into RealPage and, aggregating data, but this is something that, large corporate landlords use to, set prices. And so we do have, I know that specifically the people, I've followed up with folks, and we had like internal meeting with staff, and I know at least some of the people we spoke with helped write the ordinance in Philadelphia. So, I definitely want to continue down this path to see what we can do, because it's, affordability is a big challenge around here. So, looking forward to learning more and seeing how we can kind of best help our tenants here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. So you feel that some of the larger corporate-owned buildings in Evanston might be using some of the software, or portions of the
Some
software.
portions of the software,
Okay.
yes. I do not think our research to date has identified that anyone is using RealPage YieldStar. I think I said Yardi before, but it is YieldStar is a product of RealPage. And we have found websites that specifically say they use RealPage, but they do not use YieldStar. So it's like, that's part of the nuance with this policy is that it is an emerging technology and there are some potential benefits to this technology. However, the kind of downside to it, I think, is what we're trying to address as a municipality to ensure that there is not that coordination going on amongst the different housing providers.
And where was that U.S. versus RealPage filed? Is it in D.C. or do you know where?
I want to say it was North Carolina, but I can confirm that before the end of the meeting.
Just wondering. And then as far as the ordinances that Philadelphia and San Francisco have passed, are there any lawsuits against those ordinances by these?
Not that we're aware of at this time. So, they're relatively new, and to our knowledge and based on our research, that there are no legal challenges to those.
Fran?
Yes, I have a couple questions. The first is, how did this pop up as an issue now? I was just curious. A few people in my building have mentioned that they're aware this was coming in tonight as an issue and matter of discussion. So they said, how did this happen to pop up?
Not to put you on the spot, council member, but would you mind fielding that question, or do you want?
Yeah, I think my new hobby has been reading about housing the past 3 years. I can't remember. I was trying to look up when I first heard about this, but it's something that, like the seminar I attended, they talked about this contributing as a contributing factor to rising rents. I know the Attorney General in North Carolina.
Yes.
We have my in-laws used to live there. We have friends who still live there. Actually, just on the text thread, like a family friend had just last week, sent me info, and I was like, oh, that's interesting because we're looking into that in Evanston. So I think nationwide there's I think people are grappling with the issue of housing everywhere, and so that's kind of how I became aware of it. I'll find the date when I first heard about it, but
yeah.
And
from staff's perspective, this is an emerging policy issue that is starting to pop up in a lot of the resources that we receive from various different housing kind of coalitions or groups out there nationwide, and so it's just something that we're hypersensitive to as we watch rental prices increase in Evanston. It's not like we've drawn a correlation between the use of this technology and the rising prices. However, it is seen as a risk and an impact that could be realized just based on the knowledge of data coming in real time.
Right. And my second comment is that I also have read over the last 2 years of concerns of rising rent prices in major metropolitan areas, some in the Seattle area, some in the Washington, D.C. area. And then that led me to be directed to this fact that there's a class action lawsuit now in Tennessee that's a collection of class action suits in several states, one of which is Illinois. Illinois was not very successful, so they took their case to Seattle, and the firm here in Illinois that was doing that work was DiCello Levitt. And I actually even talked to the lead attorney for that case, and now they're in Tennessee, where there is hopefully a forum that will listen to the issues. So I think it has caught national attention, and the evolution of this United States lawsuit started with Amy Klobuchar and her committee being very, very concerned about affordable housing across the country. So I think it's very timely. And speaking to the issue, well, what if we do it in Evanston, but Chicago doesn't? I'm not sure this would not be catching because I think there is concern across the board.
Absolutely. And to respond and confirm,
Sure.
It is North Carolina. It was the Middle District, so the U.S. District Court of North Carolina that filed suit.
Yeah, thanks. Trina, is that your light? Okay.
Question around what would implementation and enforcement look like for something like this?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, I think a lot of this would be complaint driven, where tenants who are experiencing challenges or notice that their housing provider is using the type of technology that is banned. We haven't specified exactly how this would play out, but either staff or potentially a third party could support taking in those complaints and investigating them and then following up from an enforcement standpoint. So we would look at incorporating into the ordinance that would come back for your consideration kind of a process process for what that would look like, in addition to a penalty structure for violations of the ordinance. That's consistent with what we've seen in other locations that have adopted these types of regulations. And I think a lot of it comes down to how you define this technology and what you're specifically looking to enforce. And so I guess that's how we would approach it. It is a concern in terms of implementation and making sure that we have the enforcement mechanism if we are going to look at enacting some type of legislation to ban this use. So we would want to make sure that we set up some sort of system to ensure that that was enforced.
Councilmember Harakaris again.
Yeah. I think I checked my email, and I think I've been discussing this with people since like May, and and from what and the enforcement, I think from what I remember, meeting with staff, would probably be complaint based. RealPage has a map tool that you can see some of their properties. That doesn't necessarily mean they're using YieldStar, which that's the difficult part. But yeah.
Fran.
I have a question. If you have a sense of it, what kind of data does the algorithm crunch? And in other words, does it reach in and become aware of the financial status of particular renters or anything like that, or how personal does the information get that is used?
It's really about pricing, so rental pricing, so what you're asking for rent, what you're receiving for rent, your vacancy rates. I don't think that this technology really takes into consideration, at least to my knowledge at this time, income level or that granular of information. So I think it's more geared towards the price that is set for a unit and what is actually received.
Okay. Chloe.
I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you plan on researching software use among local housing providers and property managers. Like, I know a survey that says, "Have you been colluding?" is probably not going to. But seriously, I'm just kind of curious about what that plan is, how you're planning on collecting that information.
Yeah, a lot of it is going to be drilling down into websites. A lot of housing providers share this type of information on their websites, so that's what we've been able to collect up until this point. As the council member mentioned, there's also some RealPage resources out there where they do list, apartment complexes, multifamily units that do use this technology. So there is a little bit of information out there and resources that we can tap into. And so I don't want to really necessarily name names this evening of who's using what, because I think as staff, we would really like to understand a little bit more of the nuance of the different kind of permeations of the platform and not make any assumptions or accusations.
Excited to see what you learn.
Sounds good.
Okay, right. Any other comments or questions from the committee? Well, it's obviously an extremely complicated issue, so we would grant you as much time as you need to before you come back with.
Yeah, I think this is something from a drafting ordinance standpoint, it's pretty straightforward. I think the components that we would want to understand a little bit more is how we're going to define what we're banning. And again, we can rely on how some of the existing communities have approached that. And then I think we would just want to understand a little bit more of the use of this technology here in Evanston. So we'll be prepared to come back with that once the new referral is made.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. Then we can move on to our second discussion item, which is the prohibition on non-owner occupied vacation rentals. Do we want to have another motion for discussion on that? Somebody?
I will move that for discussion.
Okay, thank you. And do we have a presentation to get us to kick it off? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll walk through that really quickly. So we just wanted to provide a little bit of context in terms of the current existing conditions related to short-term rentals compared to long-term rentals here in the city of Evanston. So to back up 1 second, there was a moratorium placed on issuance of short-term rental licenses last year, and that moratorium sought for us to seek software support to have a better understanding of how many vacation rentals are here in Evanston. So since that time, the city has contracted with Granicus, which has provided the information. They pull in to their system various different short-term rental platforms like Airbnb, VRBO, some of the others that are out there. And through that software, we've been able to identify that there are a total of 238 short-term rental listings here in Evanston, and currently we have about 14,397 rental units. We currently have only 25 licensed vacation short-term rentals here in Evanston. 21 of those are owner-occupied, and only 4 are non-owner occupied. So that leaves about 213 of the total that are unlicensed across the city. Just a few other points that we wanted to mention. In terms of tax revenue from this, as part of our short-term vacation rental ordinance, the city does collect, I believe it's 7.5% on those rentals. And in January and February in 2025, we've collected about $60,000 in tax revenue from the from both licensed and unlicensed, because that's collected through the platforms that are actually being utilized by the hosts. Because we have so many non-licensed short-term vacation rentals, our property standards team, which I want to shout out really quickly because they have really revamped this program and built it from the ground up in a very short amount of time. And this is in conjunction with also rebooting the city's long-term rental inspection program, which, was in a lot of ways impacted by the COVID pandemic. So this team has really been rebuilding. So again, not to make excuses for why we have so many unlicensed, but I do want to recognize their hard efforts to make sure that we're reaching compliance. So right now they are working on ongoing enforcement. We are issuing letters via Granicus to the properties that we've identified that are unlicensed. We're also collaborating with the host platforms themselves, which have agreed. We're working with one right now who has agreed to send letters and has already to anyone that hosts on their platform to ensure that they get licensed with the city of Evanston. So we really appreciate that support from them. Real quickly, here's a map. This is from the software system that shows the approximate location of vacation rentals across the city of Evanston, so you can kind of see the distribution. My understanding of the color coding here, there are green dots, which are somewhat hard to see. The clicker's not working, but there's a little kind of group of them under the Evanston in the top area. And then the red are the unlicensed, and the orange, yellowish color, those are sites that they have not quite found the address yet. So based on the listings and the photos that are used on the platform, they can't quite figure out where the property is located. So we do have some of those as well. So kind of how does this program currently work? This is regulated by our Title V, which basically outlines that any vacation rental license that is for a owner's primary residence or that is not for an owner's primary residence must be reviewed by our Planning and Development Committee and then ultimately approved by our City Council. So that license issuance happens the first time they apply, where they get City Council approval, and then annually those properties are inspected by city staff, but there's not a need to come back to council to renew those. It's just administratively renewed. If they are violating any of the provisions, there are aspects in the ordinance that allow staff to administratively revoke those licenses. So that's the process if it's a non-owner occupied short-term vacation rental. If it's owner occupied, so the owner lives and occupies the home as their primary residence, that is administrative reviewed by staff. We still go out, we still inspect those properties, but we can issue the licenses for those currently administratively. When these go to City Council for consideration, there are standards by which they're reviewing these applications. And one thing we just want to point out, we've kind of highlighted the key components of these standards, but the council can also deny a vacation rental license upon a finding that such denial is in the public interest. So even if they find that all of these standards are met, there's still the ability to deny them if it is in the public interest. So one thing we would be seeking kind of direction on from the commission and looking to clarify with any updates that we would look at, really around the existing standards. They're pretty vague and allow for a lot of subjectivity. And I think it would be helpful just from an administration standpoint to have a little more clarity on those. Public interest is not defined and has the potential to lead to inconsistent kind of application of granting these licenses. Again, this is in the purview and discretion of the City Council, and they would need to make a finding as to what that means related to the application before them. So again, staff would be seeking the standards to be objective, clear, well-defined, and then a clear procedure for how we are going to address the applications that we have currently under review. We are trying to stagger our compliance letters that are going out, so we're not getting an influx of 200 applications all at once. So it will take a number of weeks for the city, actually probably I would say a couple of months for the city to get all of those issued as we move forward. So there's some time to work on this. The other piece that is really troublesome right now, and I think big part of the referral, is around the definition of owner occupied. There's really no criteria in our code of how we specify that other than the owner's primary residence. So we would want to know, would a unit qualify if the owner occupies it during the summer and then leaves for the winter and rents it out for 6 months? Would a detached coach house qualify as owner occupied or not? Would units within multi-unit buildings qualify if the owner lives in the building? And what proof would an owner occupant need to provide? So those are things that if the commission has any thoughts on this evening, we can help to specify that as part of updates in the future. Mm-hmm. The other component, the ordinance currently applies to a dwelling unit or portion thereof that offers for rent a period shorter than 30 consecutive days. Some municipalities use the term short-term rentals to more accurately kind of convey this use. So if you think about it, the definition of vacation rental could potentially morph to some short-term rentals that are more than 30 days, sometimes as long as 6 months. These types of lease kind of agreements offer professionals in need of short-term housing, such as traveling nurses, visiting professors, contract workers, as we heard at the City Council meeting last night. Those are the types of guests that are staying at some of the current non-owner occupied vacation rentals. And then there's also a caveat in the code that exempts units that are rented no more than one time per dwelling unit per 12-month period. So this is really difficult for staff to enforce. It's hard to know when there's only one period in a calendar year. So this would be something I think we would seek to clarify in any update moving forward and potentially eliminate. And then the other component of this ordinance really relates to the penalty structure. Currently, it's based on per violation, and then each day there's a violation, it constitutes a separate violation. So it does present some challenges in how we would administer and enforce the penalty structure, because it's not always clear how many occurrences or days the violation has been going on. So staff would propose that we shift that to increase the fines to $500 if there are license applications that are not submitted within our compliance period. And then we also would look at increasing that based on the number of days that they're not complying. So it gives it a little more different structure, and it's a little more easy to enforce from staff's perspective. I think that's the last slide. So I know that was a lot of information and not quite as concise as the other one. But I think this is one where we really are seeking direction on the commission's or the committee's kind of view on whether or not banning specifically non-owner occupied vacation rentals here in Evanston is something that you all would want to recommend, and what you would want staff, again, to bring back for further conversations in the future.
Right, yeah. Okay, thanks, Liz.
Question,
Yes,
yeah.
Joanne.
So are people just not aware that they need to be licensed, or are they just ignoring it, or what kind of response do you get?
I think this is the first time that the city has proactively sought enforcement on short-term vacation rentals, at least in the recent near past that we're aware of. So I want to give people the benefit of the doubt that they're just unaware. But that's why now we are making people aware through these notices and through the various platform hosts that there are license requirements. I'm sure there are people operating that are fully aware that this is an ordinance that the city of Evanston has. But again, because it has not been something we've been able to track historically, now that we have this software platform, it's a lot easier for us as staff to proactively enforce the regulations. Up until this point, it's been complaint-based, and so we've addressed complaints that we've received from neighbors to these units, but that's been the extent of our ability to enforce.
Yeah, that's why I've wondered whether you have gotten any complaints, because I thought at least a few years ago there were complaints people haven't allowed parties and drinking and stuff. Was that the case?
My understanding is that's what led to our current ordinance that we have on the books. But yeah, there are instances where the department does receive complaints from neighbors saying, you know, there are guests staying repeatedly at this property. You know, can you please make sure that they're following the requirements?
But otherwise, is some people renting out an extra bedroom in there?
That is the case. That, you know, there are all kinds of different models. So in the case of someone renting out a room while they're occupying the rest of the home, yes, that is one model. Those do not require city council approval. That's what could be administratively reviewed and approved by staff. It's the properties that do not have an owner occupying that premises for more than 6 months in a calendar year that would need the council consideration.
And also, I had a listing a few years ago. Now I don't remember if I even did it, but it was a professor here going on sabbatical. So it's not just professors coming in, you know. But
and I think that's an important note to think about. And as this policy does change, you know, I think what it's really trying to ensure is that we're keeping rental housing available for folks that want to live in Evanston long term and not converting them to these short term vacation rentals. I think those are examples of the latest proposals that have come before the City Council for consideration. They're properties that have been purchased specifically to be listed and hosted on these platforms. And my understanding, that's the biggest concern that I've heard, and the reason why this policy is really moving forward for consideration.
Yeah. Councilmember Harakaris.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point about the investment properties. I think we've only had 4 come to council. One, was a family who inherited a home and lives here during the summer and wanted to rent it. And something like that, I'm like, of course, that's a way for folks to, be able to keep a property, especially one that's been in the family. And then I think 2 months ago when, we received one application in the 5th Ward with a coach house, and I was like, this is 2 units that in a neighborhood that is being gentrified, and this was purchased just for an investment property. And I think that's contributing, to our housing problems that we see here. I want to also give a shout out to staff. I've had friends who said that the process of getting their short-term rental license was super easy. And so there shouldn't be any administrative hurdles, especially if it's a, owner occupied. That's a way for people to be able to live here too. So I think, some of your questions about, how do we determine if it's owner occupied? I mean, personally, I think as long as someone lives here a few months out of the year, it should be similar to showing your mail and your bills in your name. I think living in the detached coach house is fine. Living in a unit in the building, I think where I want us to be is so that we're not incentivizing people from snatching up attainable homes and using them to make money. So I think that's, my main concern. As far as, it was really interesting that the number that you showed about how much, revenue we make. And we only have it
was
12,
2 months.
12%
It was
of the properties are registered. So we are missing out on probably tens of thousands of dollars monthly from people not being registered.
potentially. My understanding is that the platforms themselves are collecting the tax at the time of booking. And so we receive those direct payments monthly from the host platform, not from the individual hosts. We are still looking into ensuring that the tax that we are collecting is incorporating all of the various host platforms and not just a few of them. So there's the potential that the revenue could actually increase beyond what we're currently showing for the first 2 months. So that is a component that staff is very interested in drilling down and understanding, because I think it's a big consideration for the council if we're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars of tax revenue. So again, it's just something that we want to have detailed data on as this moves forward.
Okay. I guess that kind of leads into my next question. So we're not quite sure if there are revenues that we're not, and I'm assuming each of the platforms probably handles it a little bit different.
Correct. Yeah. So we're coordinating with all of the various platforms that we're aware of at this time to ensure that they are collecting and providing that tax to the city.
And roughly how many different platforms? I know of 2. But
I think there's probably around
There was actually a listing that there were over 60 of them nationwide, but we don't know how many of them are operating here yet. I don't believe we have anywhere near that number.
Yeah.
Because some of them are kind of local or regional, but that's something else we're trying to learn more about. It's really complicated. And the other interesting thing is when you have the platforms, I mean, I don't think I've heard of any of the really bad party houses to the extent that in some of the suburbs where people will rent out these very large fancy homes and they become really quite remarkable nuisances. There was one in either Northbrook or Northfield or something like that. Those frequently are not being rented through the services. You know, those are kind of the worst ones sometimes, the ones that somebody is just renting them out because they can get away with that, and people find it out not through any of the portals because, you know, Airbnb and stuff like that, many of us have used it. You look at the reviews on what you're renting, you know, so they actually, I think, are not necessarily the ones that are most likely to be disruptive in the neighborhoods. Although I am aware of a unit that's in North Evanston that I don't know that there any real disturbance in terms of people making noise and stuff, but coming and going of different people all the time has upset
in
neighbors.
my ward.
Yes.
I've heard a lot from the neighbors who are very unhappy.
Yes,
yeah.
But I'm not sure that it's disruptive or they're just uncomfortable with the coming and going. You know what I mean? Because what I hear is, well, there are always a new car showing up there. We know, and that is one that we have registered as owner occupied. Because
the neighbors are quite convinced that the owner actually lives in Wilmette or some other community.
Yes, and that's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
We were going by driver's licenses and at the time, I believe, and driver's licenses may not be the best thing to use. So, yeah, it's complicated, you know.
Yeah, it is. Other...
Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I guess I was, in terms of proof of residency, I guess I would say not the utility bills, because you could, if you had a vacation rental and you were living elsewhere, you might still have the utility bill in your name, and maybe even to that address. Anyway, I would have thought driver's license would be pretty good, but voter registration cards, I don't know, yeah. I guess the only thing I want to throw in at this point is I did find an article, an Economic Policy Institute article from 2019. But anyway, it really did talk about the cost, the economic costs Airbnb imposes likely outweigh the benefits. Rising housing costs are a key problem for American families, and evidence suggests that the presence of Airbnb raises local housing costs. And so I think that's the main concern that we're having here, that would raise costs and also just take up units that could be available to a local family. You've posed a lot of complicated questions for us, Liz.
You're welcome.
I think one thing that will be very helpful is as we actually work on registering the existing ones, how many of them qualify. And I think that if you have better, or if you have guidance on, any more guidance on what we should look at, I mean, we could ask for equivalent of real ID. I don't know. But, it's kind of like, how do we do that? I think we owe you that kind of information because it may be people helping stay in their homes too, so we really need to find out how big the problem is. I mean, there are, I think it was San Diego at one point had a $3,000 registration fee or licensing fee because there were so many, it's such a vacation place.
Right.
So I'm hoping that we can get more information that can inform, and we may have to come back with some of that information. It's a little hard to make decisions when we know so little about really what we're trying to make policy decisions on. So,
One question I would have for the committee this evening, the referral specifically speaks to banning non-owner occupied vacation rentals. We've talked this evening about how there may be the potential of certain circumstances of what would be considered non-owner occupied. Where is the temperature, I guess, of the commission as it relates to the ban versus trying to really address some of what we're hearing in terms of investor-only short-term vacation rentals? I don't know if that is a potential way to look at how we regulate non-owner occupied and still allow some opportunity for it. But again, we just want to recognize that there are some good uses for having the ability to rent a property for a month or 2 months while you may be in a challenging circumstances like a home fire, for example, or you're displaced and looking for permanent housing. So we just want to make sure that we're dotting all of our I's and crossing all of our T's.
Right, yeah. Councilmember Harakaris.
I think, for me at least, if someone has a tie to like someone going on a sabbatical, even if they're here because of that circumstance, like maybe 1 month out of the year, like that, we should have some flexibility for people who actually have a tie to that home and they're not using it just as an investment. So it's an interesting thing that Councilmember Revelle mentioned about the driver's license, because I was thinking like, yeah, your utility bill, but I think we even have like a more extensive list of proving your residence for a beach pass, really, like so I think we can do, like, maybe it has to be a combination of things, because obviously, like, the more you think about it, there's probably have your mortgage statement, your utility, but if you have to say maybe your voter registration and like maybe your Netflix bill, I don't know, like, or your I think we can figure that out, but I think it has to be probably a combination of things in order to
more than just one piece of ID.
Yeah, because I think you could have a lapsed, or your voter registration could be old and like, oh, I guess I do still vote in 7th Ward, but like I don't live there anymore, which I think, if we figure out some combination, I think we could kind of close that loophole. But I think, like I said, when that one family came with the home where they're here part of the year, that's like, yes, of course, that's fine. But I think, trying to figure out how to kind of shut the door on the investment piece, I think, at least for me, is important.
Thank you.
Yeah. Chloe.
Good point. So I don't have a great answer either. These are really good questions. I wish I had more answers, but I was just thinking about, so when I moved to California, I needed to establish residency, and I needed to provide just different types of documentation to show that I had been living there for, a certain period of time. And I wonder if, in the absence of, okay, so you're not declaring this as your homestead, right, for tax purposes, because maybe you've inherited the place and are coming back in the summer, and so you own it, but you're not really an owner occupant, but maybe you sort of provide sort of documentation that shows that you are present in Evanston for, this amount of time every summer or something. Like I said, it's kind of onerous. I'm just kind of thinking out loud, though.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
Trina.
I think there are some places that have actually also made allowed not owner occupancy necessarily, but if the owner of the property lived in the same town. I think, I'm not sure that always ensures that they're going to manage the property well, but that's another thing that some places have looked at. And one of the things that I think I would like us to consider is, do we look at short-term rentals as opposed to vacation rentals? Because many of the people using these platforms will rent for more than, we're saying less than 30 days. And that isn't really a real thing. And so we're never going to be able to enforce that, I don't think, with any of so I would like to see us take out that restriction or that definition. And then there are people who are searching for that in-between length of housing, like these traveling nurses and things like that. And how do we accommodate them? And are they likely to be able to be accommodated by owner-occupied renters? I don't know. These are other questions that I think are challenging. There's a real change in how people, my husband and I were in Italy, we were on a tour of the, in Rome with a couple that they were both traveling nurses. They didn't own a home. They had a mobile home, but they didn't always want to live in that. So sometimes they were looking for places and they'd be living there for 6 months to 8 months, and then they'd move on. And I was like, there are real different lifestyles that may not be mine, but we have to be aware of.
Yeah. Trina, go ahead.
Thank you. To talk about the classification of whether or not to have it as a vacation rental or something else, could there possibly be 2 categories? So 30 days and under would be vacation, and anywhere between 31 and let's say 6 months could be extended stay, like that type of category or categorization.
Yeah, that's definitely a potential opportunity to address, both the short-term stays and the longer-term stays, and potentially having different standards for reviewing each of those types of uses would be appropriate as well.
And then, thank you. And then, in addition to the documentation, do you already require some type of attestation from them where they say that this is okay? So that's a part of it.
Yes, it's part of the application form. When they apply, they're attesting that everything is factual and accurate and all of that. We could potentially look at a supplemental attestation form that was a little more specific to owner occupancy. And that's one ability, to look at enforcement down the road. If it's found that they are not occupying, it's grounds for revoking the license.
And then my last question is around not necessarily coach houses, have to think through that a bit more, but let's say multi-unit buildings. The thought of maybe creating some type of threshold. So if it's 2 units, then the owner occupied threshold is 50%. If it's more than like 3, 4, 6 units, since we're looking at, building more of those, then maybe creating some type of threshold where it is, in order to be owner occupied, they have to reside in so many different units, them and their family, for instance.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
That's an interesting point, because one of the discussions about the 12 small homes, one of the concerns was, is this just going to be turned into a vacation rental space? So thank you for that. I do just want to bring something up about the different lengths of time. It appears, even from the gentleman who was at council yesterday, that he did some like weekend ones, and then he had some construction workers who were living there for a longer period of time. So I don't know how we would differentiate that, because I don't think the providers necessarily differentiate it that way. So that's something we've got to learn more about, and maybe we can actually get more information from the platforms on the length of stays that are common and how they balance out, because I don't think we know.
Yep. Fran.
Yeah, and the one thing that struck me, and maybe it's irrelevant and probably is, to the topic, but to what extent is it an invasion of privacy to have people, homeowners, register if they're just renting a room to a college student? I mean, there's that whole spectrum of at what point do we not legislate reporting. Yes.
So
Don't want to intrude on what we consider home sharing. Somebody who does that on an ongoing basis, because it just gets us into a whole nother, that is less transient, and that again is frequently one of their means of staying in their home.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. But that's the problem. There are a
Where
lot
do you
of,
stop?
yeah, exactly. Exactly. But in our code right now, that if you only do one vacation rental a year, you don't have to get licenses, also giving us problems because, so I think that we have to somehow define that more clearly. So it's not like if you've got someone who's living there for a period of time and is, sharing your house literally, because then we undo things that we don't want to undo. It's a challenge.
Right. Councilmember Harris.
Yep, Fran, I really appreciate that comment because I think probably as we go forward, more people will be doing more cooperative housing and home sharing. One thing, kind of talking about the short-term versus long-term rentals. I know one thing that Ike's staff and Human Services does when especially when people are going through like a home fire or have extenuating circumstances, and the city houses folks. And one of the things that I remember from working with them is many times extended stay hotels are great, but we actually looked at short-term rentals because it's actually cheaper to stay sometimes in those rather than staying at like a short-term stay hotel. So there is
And it can be
is
better
a
for
it is a
families.
useful tool for folks, especially home something happens at your home, displaced. Yeah.
I did want to bring up something that's been discussed that I think we need to think about too, and that is whether or not we should ever attempt to post who is doing these short-term rentals or these different rentals. And one of the problems is if it's an owner-occupied, I think that is intruding on people's privacy. And so I personally don't think that is something we should do. We list regular 12-month rental, that type of, because it's a business, and our property maintenance code says they have to have the contact information for the, manager posted on the exterior of the building. So, that's a different type of situation, but I think there's a privacy issue with owner occupied, certainly. And the other thing is, because it's not like a hotel where you can, you know where hotels are because you can go and try to rent them, even if, stay overnight, even if you haven't made reservations ahead of time. But all of these are reservations first. So I think that's a consideration that I just wanted to bring up that's been discussed that I don't think we've looked at the downside of.
Yeah.
Is that you?
That's me.
Okay.
Yeah. My son-in-law is a carpenter, and he worked for a company several years ago, and they were sending him all over the country, and he would be there for 4 or 6 weeks sometimes. A bunch of them would be in an apartment, somewhere. But then, as far as you bring up nurses, do we know if Evanston and St. Francis have, roaming nurses and what they're doing for providing housing for them now? And I do, glad we brought up senior sharing, so that seniors can stay in their home and, share. That's not short term, but yeah. So do we know if Evanston?
We don't. We can definitely explore that and their use of traveling nurses. I think that's just an industry-wide trend, just given shortages currently. So I wouldn't be shocked to learn that they do employ traveling nurses, but I can't say with 100% confidence this evening.
One scenario that we haven't talked about, you asked about the coach house situation. I mean, I could envision the homeowner in the main house doesn't have family members or anybody staying in the coach house, but being able to rent that out provides a little bit extra income that allows the homeowner to, pay the mortgage and stay in Evanston. So I'm inclined to want to allow that.
Okay, thank you.
I also do remember at one point, this was back in when we were doing ADU, first
Right,
looking at
exactly.
ADUs. One of the things that some cities were allowing was people to do short-term rental when they first build an ADU to help pay off the cost of it. And then, so, but that's kind of owner occupied if they're living on the property to me. So, but we also are hoping to potentially use ADUs as a long-term rental, so we've got the same issue there sometimes.
Right, yep. Fran?
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking here, my brain is thinking of columns, and we need to, or if I were going to be doing any more with this, I'd have to make columns of risks and benefits and situations and dollar benefits and also what the harm is.
Sure.
How is X hurting? I get that if somebody's not here and they're renting to people on the internet and there's a big party, it's very detrimental to the property and to the neighborhood and to the community. So that needs to be, I'm sure, that's a huge concern. But some of these other scenarios are, I think, benefiting the property owners.
Yeah, no, that's a good
More
structure
than
to
hurting.
bring back further discussion on this topic. So
I
thank you.
get this, we're just starting, but so these ideas are starting to kick in.
Yep.
Thanks.
Communities that limit the number that can be in certain areas, which is especially trying to control areas like more modest housing that they want to preserve as for full-time residents, I guess. So I think we need to look more at those types of options because it's not a simple thing. It's really complicated. And that's one of the problems because in some cases, competing goals can, we can end up with competing goals like, ADUs can be for permanent residents or they can be for, it's complicated.
Yes, that's me. Yeah, I just wonder, are the two large houses that Jennifer Pritzker owned and, turned into where they considered Airbnbs, are they still being rented out or what is their situation?
Well, they were sold. I don't know. No, those were not individual. Those are multiple rooms and there were people living on, or there were people staffed there, regularly, and they were getting literally, we call them Airbnbs, but very few actually have bed and breakfast. They're more housing, they're temporary housing. Most of them may provide some food, but it's not like they make you breakfast and stuff like that.
Yeah. So what are they? So we don't know, once he sold it, we don't know how they're being used?
I am not aware of those two particular buildings, but they would fall under our rooming house and that, which would be under shared housing.
Trina, did you? No, okay. Well, committee, I think we've thrown out a lot of
No, thank you. This has
conflicting
been
information for you.
no, but it's good to understand a little bit of the perspective of the commission because there's, as I mentioned, a lot of different ways that we can go. And so I think our next step will be, again, to wait for that re-referral. And then we'll come back with some additional research. I like the idea of some of the pros and cons. And I think we'd also want to float some alternative proposals for your consideration. And then probably come back for a vote.
Great. Okay, thank you, Liz. Are you doing the staff update as well? It's on the agenda.
I don't know if I have a ton for the staff update. I do know that I want to just put a flag out there that we are working to reboot the strategic housing plan process. So there'll be more information on that coming to the commission relatively soon. That's something that we are very aware of the need to move that forward. And staff is excited to get back to it now that the Envision Evanston process is wrapping up with the Land Use Commission and moving on to City Council. It'll allow us to focus on that effort a little bit further. But But beyond that, I want to thank Chair Ravel. This is her last meeting. You have been an amazing leader and really great to work with from staff's perspective. So thank you for that. And I'm not sure who will be able to fill your shoes, but I'm sure we'll find out relatively soon.
I'm sure you'll find someone. Yeah. Well, on that note, so the commission's next meeting is May 20th, and I wish everybody well at that meeting and beyond, and continuing to wrestle with these really complex issues that we've been discussing this evening. It's really important for us to get this right. So then I believe we are finished with our agenda. Thank you all very much.